morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Stephen Everts. For those who don't know me, I'm the director of the EUISS. Really pleased that many of you have come this morning. We're going to nurture you and feed you with, I think, quite an interesting product. So what are we going to do today? We're going to present you the results of a survey that we've conducted in partnership with the European University Institute in Florence. And I want to begin by underlining how much I've enjoyed working together with Eric Jones, with Veronica Angel and the EUI team to do this project together. It's an interesting project, because what is it? It's an expert survey across Europe, looking at how Europeans look at the threat landscape. What are the threats that are coming our way? What is their likelihood and what is their impact? This is a different kind of exercise from the ones that you can also have, and it's also interesting, but when it looks at sort of broader public opinion surveys. When you look at the totality of our populations and what they're worrying about and what they're thinking about. Here we went for the expert survey. And when you use the word expert, it always reminds me of this phrase by a British minister at the time, Michael Gove, who at the time of the Brexit discussion, he had this phrase, well, frankly, the country has had enough of experts and people from organizations with acronyms that always get it wrong. Well, I think a lot of those people are in this room. And we also know how the Brexit story ended. Maybe it's not ended yet. Anyway, we thought there was a reason to ask people in policymaking, people in think tanks, people in universities for their views on the security landscape. And that's what we're going to do this morning. It's quite a sobering picture, I believe, that emerges. I'm not going to go into the findings because my colleagues will do it. But yeah, thank you all for coming. The way it's going to run this morning is first we're going to hear the results and have some visuals to support that. We have a first set of reactions from the policymaking side, so from the European Union. I'm very glad that we have my former boss Enrique Mora with us, but also Benedetta Berti from NATO, because security, EU and NATO perspectives are both extremely important. Then a very short break, but then we'll take it back for a wider panel debate, and we're going to look at the angles from different capitals. How does it look in different parts of Europe? Different professional angles, journalists, think tankers, academics. Do these people look differently at the world? And other US angle as well. So thank you for coming. Let me hand the floor now to my friend and colleague Eric Jones, and then we'll get started. Please, thank you. Eric.
Well, look, my job is very simple. It's just to tell you how we ended up here. And it starts with a meeting in January of 2023 at the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, when I witnessed the launch of what was probably then the 13th or 14th edition of the Preventive Priorities Survey that they had been doing there, and the attention that it gathered. And as I listened to the conversation that surrounded that survey, which is an expert survey of council members in the United States, I thought there's no reason why we cannot do that here. And doing that here in Europe gained greater insight into what are European foreign policy priorities, but also how we could compare those policy priorities here in Europe with those in the United States and assess the health of the transatlantic relationship in terms of the way it perceives the outside world. It took about 2 years to bring that idea into fruition, primarily because we had to build an amazing team, which we've succeeded in doing, not just in terms of designing the survey, but also in terms of reaching out to the wider community to make sure that we get as many responses as we need to tell you something meaningful. Just to give you a sense of the effort involved, we had to contact more than 5,000 individuals to get 400 responses. So we're talking about an 8% response rate. We're hoping that the success of this proof of concept will encourage more people to participate in the future. we had to build that whole team. And once we did, we had to decide what were the parameters. And the most important parameter that we started with was to mirror in as many ways as possible the Preventive Priorities Survey in the United States so that we retained that comparability. And that means we focus on issues associated with violent conflict that are supposed to arise or may arise in the coming year, which is why we don't survey everybody on climate change and it doesn't turn out to be the biggest risk we're all going to face. It's not that climate change is not important, it's just that these violent conflicts are things that we think focus the attention of policymakers and want to highlight them for significance. The other thing is we needed to synchronize the timing so that the surveys in the United States are influenced by the same geopolitical events as the surveys in Europe. We chose a timing that starts by fielding the questions after the US presidential elections and then closes toward the end of November. So in this year, it was November, I think it was 19th to the end of the month for 2024. And having set that frame, what we needed to do was to decide which questions to ask. Some of the questions are the same as were asked in the Preventive Priorities Survey, which you can find on the Council on Foreign Relations website, but some were different because Europe has different security considerations that it has to confront. And we had to decide what methods we were going to use. We did make some changes over the methodology that's used at the Council on Foreign Relations. We introduced a longer scale, so we used a 5-point scale instead of a 3-point scale. We created the opportunity for respondents to say they do not know, so we don't have people guessing on issues where they really don't have adequate information. And we collected enough demographic data to know where people are coming from, where their area of expertise lies, what is their professional commitment, and a host of other different considerations that we might use to test whether there is variation across the strategic culture in the European context. And we'll get to whether that test is successful when we do the results. We've asked for each of the scenarios that people assess the likelihood and the impact. And they assess these two things separately, and we combine likelihood and impact into our measure of risk. So when we talk about these things, what we're talking about is both likelihood and impact at the same time. But we tried to suggest scenarios that were important, which means on average, you would expect the impact to get a higher rating than the likelihood. We don't really want things that are definitely going to happen but have no importance. We want things that are important even if they may not happen. And a final point I would suggest is that we have only 30 questions because just like you guys listening to me, the world is full of people with limited attention spans. And if we asked more than 30 questions, then they would just tune out and start looking at their email again. So we were convinced that 30 questions was the maximum that we could hit. Now, what we are presenting this time is a proof of concept. And a proof of concept means that we can modify it and improve it so that it's more useful both for members of the academic community and people in the policy community. And the use case is real. We have already begun preliminary findings presentations with the U.S. Congress, with the Congressional Research Service, with the Policy and Planning Division of the U.S. State Department, and with the European External Action Service, and the conversations have been great. That doesn't mean we can't do better. So we're hoping that you guys will all take advantage of the opportunity to hear about this, to feed back into the process so that in our next iteration, what we deliver is something even more useful than this time around. Now, all of that having been said, there are a number of thanks I have to give, and I'll try to do this quickly, but they are heartfelt. First and foremost to Paul Stairs and the Council on Foreign Relations for the inspiration, support, and guidance throughout this process. Steven Everts and the EUISS because they've provided invaluable feedback. They brought you all together and they've helped a lot in getting the word out. Mariam Kotanashvili and the Trans-European Policy Studies Association, whose fabulous network of institutions and colleagues ensured that we got the responses that we needed. Hugo Mayer, and the European Initiative for Security Studies, which is an academic network that I hope will come ever more increasingly to your attention. My own team at the Robert Schuman Centre, who've made all of this possible for Veronica and for me, and most important, all of you, both in this room and outside, who filled out the survey and who gave your advice and guidance on where we should go from here. So thank you all, and now I'll stop talking and hand over to Veronica so you can hear what you came to see. Veronica, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Politico called us this morning the worst-case scenario department, and I am here to actually show you that that is exactly the case. So it's, oh, the green, yeah. Okay, there we go. So 2024 was a very bad year. We saw the rise of authoritarian movements everywhere, and we also witnessed yet again the number of active violent conflicts rise to levels unseen since World War II. And yet we knew that the worst was yet to come. Which is why we set up this exercise to try to think about what are the most worrying sources of threat and to get ahead of the deluge that was just around the corner. We looked into the crystal ball, which we really like to do, and focus on the sources of threat. Those sources of threat are drawn on this collective knowledge from experts, and they're based on our expert peers' opinions and put together in this set of risks that we could get ahead of. Now here we start off with a general map of where the risks are distributed. As Eric mentioned, we look at 30 risks. They are distributed all over the world, but the greatest source of threat you will see is associated with Russia's war of choice against Ukraine. So we're going to focus on that a bit, even if we have a 5-point scale that the experts could measure impact and risk. The risks cluster in a top impact, top likelihood groups, because, and we expected them to do so exactly because we chose those risks that are of the highest impact and of the highest likelihood because they're the most relevant. You will immediately notice that at the time that we fielded the survey, we did not consider US invasion of Denmark, which is our bad. We also thought that if we were to consider a war between Canada and the United States, that would have been a very, very low level risk, and it's not worth anyone's time. Again, our bad. So the things that we have now gathered are in these 3 tiers: high risk, moderate risk, and remote risk. And I am going to only highlight some of the main findings and some surprising elements that I hope will draw your attention, and then we can focus more during the conversation. If you haven't done that already, please download the report from one of the QR codes that you see in the room and on the cards at the back, or just Google it online. You will find it immediately. So let's get into our top concerns. Perhaps it won't surprise anyone that the greatest risk that was identified by our experts was a ceasefire favorable to Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war. Of course, this is a major concern, particularly now as this situation and this possibility is amplified by the policies of the new Trump administration that seems to be pushing for a rushed peace settlement. The second important thing to notice is that our experts do not actually foresee a durable peace in the Israel-Hamas war. Although the start of the year has given us some hope with a ceasefire agreement, it's actually a very high likelihood of no ceasefire that our almost 400 unique experts are foreseeing, of course with a high impact for all EU interests. And the third thing that I would suggest that you notice is that the impact of U.S. isolationism, which we define as U.S. withdrawal from security guarantees to European allies, also ranks very high. In fact, it ranks as high, if you look on this moderate risk maps, it ranks as high as the use of nuclear weapons by Russia. So this is actually a pretty surprising finding. We know that the EU is dependent on US for its security guarantees. However, we do have a very anxious set of experts here that are really seeing a huge problem coming from the United States when it comes to the possibility for the EU to preserve its security, its prosperity, coherence, and unity. I would also like to draw your attention in this category of what we call moderate risks, although you will notice that these are all really bunched up in a very high position on the scale, to what experts in Europe consider as threatening coming from the Indo-Pacific. You will notice that aggressive Chinese action in the South China Sea is seen as a very likely event by our experts, and so is a cross-strait military conflict between China and Taiwan, which is foreseen as also having a higher impact. However, if you look at the indicator for the likelihood of US-China direct military confrontation, you will see that it has a high impact, but a low likelihood. So you might immediately notice that, okay, is it possible that European experts actually don't believe that the United States will hold up to its security guarantees for its allies in the Indo-Pacific? And again, this correlates with the high likelihood that experts in Europe give to United States withdrawal from its security guarantees to NATO partners. So again, there's a lot of threat that is coming from one of our main allies, which the experts identify. Moving forward in the remote risk category, which is still quite important, it's still pretty high. Here we've maintained some of the attention on places where the EU actually sends military missions and training missions. So we still look at places in Africa, in the Sahel, and in the Horn of Africa. And these are really show that our experts know also what they're talking about, because they do see the likelihood of the continuation of these conflicts that have been some of the bloodiest conflicts of the year, and this is really perceived as an important source of threat to look at in the coming years. So there's a lot of information here that hopefully you will have time to digest as you download the report, and we will continue talking about in the panel. This is just a quick note to mention that the average likelihood of our conflict is indeed lower than the average impact because of the reasons that we mentioned before. We focused on purpose on those conflicts that could be most relevant, and we do give attention to high impact scenarios. So on average, it's important that we stay focused on those conflicts that are most relevant, so that we could have a contribution for policymaking, right? The resources are scarce, our attention span is scarce, so we have to make the right choices when we concentrate our resources. Finally, I want to say something about our sample, right? For the academics in the room, you might know that we really want to see variation, because variation is good. When it comes to foreign policy, I put on my hopeful citizen hat on, and I was really hoping that there wouldn't be that much variation among experts in Europe in what they think on foreign policy priorities. And indeed, that this is what our sample shows. What we see across different categories of respondents is that they seem to have similar opinions. So these are not experts that think differently depending on proximity to Russia or proximity to sources of migration. And so this is actually an important finding. Experts seem to be aligned across the EU. We've had a sample that was, I think, we curated it quite well. This is a set of unique respondents. We focused on those respondents that were only EU citizens or who resided in the EU, because others might have different kind of priorities or might rank their interests differently. You will see that the majority of our experts come from Brussels, Belgium, which is not surprising because this is where most of the people who work on these sort of issues are present. And thank you very much to those of you who have taken the survey, and hopefully you will do so again. And we have reached also to colleagues in Central and Eastern Europe. Important for us is that we've reached both academia and policymakers. So it's a balanced sample, but of course we can distribute it even further. It's a very high-level sample. Most people, almost 60% have a doctoral degree, so they know what they're talking about. Even if even if the majority are male, okay? So you see, there's mitigating factors there. But unfortunately, speaking as a woman, I think that's also quite representative of how experts are distributed here. Okay, and also the important was that this alignment that I've mentioned exists across expertise as well. It was important to target mostly EU foreign policy experts, but we've also reached out to others, and this was quite good. So this means that we've had I think a pretty good run when it comes to the tool itself, and hopefully it will be resistant. But in terms of content, what we do see is that the EU needs to switch into crisis mode, and it has to consider its likely choices much better, including whether it wants a ceasefire in the Russia-Ukraine war that is likely to be favorable to Russia, whether it has to look at the Middle East and think better about just saying, oh, this is over, this is not over, and also try to really have an answer to what's happening in the United States, to which I think the EU has been rather silent so far. But to start this conversation, let me invite the two panelists, Enrique Mora, who is Deputy Secretary General of the EUISS, and Benedetta Croce, who is the Director of Planning at NATO. And let's start the conversation. I'll just go back, if there is a back, or no, to the... If you want to go back to any kind of slide that caught your attention, that would be great. Enrique, I would start with you. I don't think the EU is ready for this, am I right?
Not completely, but you should define what completely is. On the first risk, I completely agree. Is a badly negotiated ceasefire in Ukraine is by far the highest risk for the European Union now, for different reasons. First, we understand that badly negotiated means that Putin will simply regroup and prepare for the future for continuing, which is obviously his objective, which is basically to subjugate Ukraine and control the country. The European Union has been working already for some time to face that scenario. There is another issue which is not in the, or maybe it's in the risk, I don't know, in the detailed report, which is we were quite united when Putin started the aggression. I'm not entirely sure we will be so united in peace because the interests will be different. So again, we had been preparing for that. It's fundamental two things. First, if there is a ceasefire, we should keep sanctions and we should keep assets frozen. Second, if there is a ceasefire, we have to give very robust security guarantees to Ukraine. On that conditions, we could turn a ceasefire into something more permanent. Territory is a different thing. We will see how we deal with that. But to your question, Veronica, yes, we had been preparing for that scenario. But as things unfold, we will be facing something different than anticipated. And this is, again, a huge risk. Yeah.
So just to keep in the spirit of the survey, if you would think that there is a likelihood that that would happen, right? That there is a ceasefire favorable to Russia.
Yeah.
How exactly are we prepared?
No, first, I think most of the respondents are right. If that could happen in 25, why? Because it's obvious the exhaustion of the military on both sides, in particular on Ukraine. So wars, when they don't end total victory, they end up by exhaustion. So I think there is a high probability that in 25 we will see, if not a complete ceasefire, a negotiation in parallel with a diminished level of violence, something like that. Again, we had been preparing that scenario with implementing a very robust scheme of sanctions, with freezing all the assets, financial assets of Vladimir Putin outside Russia, in Europe and the United States and Canada. And the third part of this story, that's the European Union at the negotiating table, is, the jury is still out on that. It's not entirely clear. Putin wants a bilateral negotiation with the United States, full stop, without not even Ukraine at the table, which is a joke, is a sad joke. But it's not just a question of Ukraine, it's a question also of Europe, because the future of Ukraine is in Europe. It doesn't make any sense to have a peace process without Europe in that case.
In the United States, we've seen that also the same experts who would anticipate this unfavorable ceasefire agreement also see that the United States is also very likely not to participate in giving these security guarantees. Where do you see the negotiations? Have they even started? Are they picking up the phone these days?
It's very difficult to anticipate such a radical decision on the side of the United States. Maybe you know more, but frankly speaking, I cannot conceive that the United States completely take out of this situation, which is a threat for the national interest of the United States. So I cannot think in terms that the United States will simply have nothing to do with the security guarantees in the future, because the security guarantees, if we are talking about boots on the ground, this is different. But security guarantees in the broader sense, I cannot conceive without the United States, and without NATO.
Yes, probably. The issue with security guarantees is that part of what makes them credible is that there is belief that the United States will stand behind its allies. And unfortunately, what I think that the survey shows is that that belief is dwindling. And that is already a loss, because deterrence works if those guarantees are credible. So in that sense, I'm still sticking to the worst case scenario department moniker we received today, and not being particularly hopeful in this. But perhaps, Benedetta, what is the view from NATO in terms of preparation for all this.
For the high risks.
For the
Yeah.
high risks.
Well, I would say, maybe I'll take one step back before I take one step and dig deeper into one particular scenario. And I think listening to your presentation and looking at the map of risk, your first slides, I think what I would start with is this really exemplifies to me what has been our dominant strategic assumptions for the past few years, which is we are in the most complex, volatile, and dangerous security environment that we have seen as transatlantic community, as Europeans, in the few generations. And I think this is a good visual representation of why that is. Looking at the risks very briefly, I think what's very interesting is that you really exemplify that we are in a situation with the threat landscape. It's truly cross-cutting. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, you have risks that go from the kinetic to the non-kinetic, so really across the spectrum, cyber attacks, more sustained hybrid activities and destabilization campaigns, which I think we are seeing playing out in this very weeks. So cross domain, I think it's very important that the experts reflect that, because I think that's a key policy point in how do we prepare, the importance of comprehensive security, resiliency, and really looking at the full spectrum of how do you counter from economic coercion to kinetics to sabotage to cyber attacks. So the cross domain is very interesting to me. The other element is the cross theater. And I think that's also very important. The map here shows that we mostly care, and that's a function of geography and national interest, about the Euro-Atlantic area. That makes a lot of sense. But I think it's important that we also see those connections between Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic and Middle East as those three main theaters of geopolitical competition in the world. If I'm looking at this map very briefly, just to set the conversation, I would say, I would put some question marks in terms of, for example, the fact that we see the impact on European security of many crises and conflicts in the African continent as relatively limited. Is that a sign that over the last few years we've gotten progressively used to a lowering of peace and to a condition of permanent crisis? And what does that mean for our toolkit? That's one of my observations, seeing that, yes, we know there's a lot of crises coming our ways, but we are not too worried, simply because there's so many other things we have to choose from. So I think that's interesting. We might have a little blind spot on Latin America. Maybe, I don't know, I just put it out there. And on the Indo-Pacific, I also find it very interesting, and that's maybe a point of this, I also dutifully filled the survey, and one point of not disagreement, but where I'm maybe less of an optimist than some of our experts is on looking at the potential impact of on European security on crisis in the Indo-Pacific. I think we may be a little complacent. I think if indeed there was to be a full-size crisis in the Indo-Pacific, it would have a much dire and direct economic, geopolitical, and security impact on us. So we may be underestimating that a little bit, but I don't know. So the so what for policy of this risk map, which I find really fascinating for me, is this is in a nutshell what we've been saying for since 2022 with the 22 strategic concept at NATO, which is we're not at war, but we're not at peace. Mm-hmm. This is not a peacetime threat assessment. And the question of are we prepared? I think glass is half full. We're doing what we need to, but we need to do more if we really want to match this strategig environment. It's about strengthening the military instrument of power, defense spending. It's about resiliency. It's about comprehensive security. But I also one more, and then I'll stop. Looking at risk is really important, but we also should never lose sight that there are opportunities to seize. So the world is not a friendly place at the moment, but I don't think we should. I think the risk lens is important, but needs to be coupled, especially for policymakers, with our so what? What are the opportunities? Where can we increase our leverage, our influence, our power projection? Where can we make a positive difference? So that's my bird's eye view to the risks.
I want to focus a little bit a bit more on Russia, Ukraine. I know that this is at the back of our minds, but also I want to draw your attention to what experts think on the likelihood of the use of nuclear weapons by Russia. This is the item that's scored as the least likelihood scenario. High impact, of course, but least likely. And this was somewhat surprising, maybe not to me. I would have also scored it as low likelihood. But there is a lot of conversation in the public sphere about Russia's rhetoric, bullying tactics, and so on. And to some extent, the association of Russia's use of nuclear, threat of use of nuclear weapons is what leads to the idea of a ceasefire under any conditions as well. So I'm wondering if you agree that this is maybe an overblown conversation in the public sphere on the fact that Russia is a nuclear power, and we should consider it and be mindful of it, but also not take it as the main deterrent in being more resourceful, more creative, and stronger on Russia in Ukraine.
On the nuclear weapons, there are two different things, I think. First, the threat. Putin has threatened a number of times with using nuclear weapons, both strategic and tactical. It backfired against him, these threats, only because the Chinese didn't like it at all. So the message was very clear. So this is one thing. The threat has not had any impact, on the opposite. The real question is, and it's very difficult to answer, is would Vladimir Putin use nuclear weapons? In which situation? When? What should happen? That's the point. I think we cannot say no completely, because by now I think we know the guy. But at the same time, it's very difficult to precise in which conditions he would use it. It's very difficult to precise which is the internal distribution of power inside the Kremlin and inside the system, because the use of nuclear weapons doesn't depend only on one button. This is a legend. It works in a different way, and it's not entirely clear that other parts of the establishment would go for that. So, on the threat, backfire. On the real use, it's a possibility, but I don't think we know in which conditions that could happen. He always said himself, if Russia is invaded, we will go for it. But then he said, well, Donbass is part of Russia constitutionally, and he didn't do anything. Well, we see now Kursk, that's in Moscow. So it's very difficult to say, but that he would use, I don't have any doubt.
Right. What are you hearing at NATO? I also want to connect this with the fact that we checked to see if experts have any thoughts on the destabilizing power struggle in Moscow that many people are hoping that will lead to some change, and this is also ranked as low likelihood, and I think that's accurate.
Well. On the different scenarios, I think the pattern and why the Russian Federation figures so prominently is actually a sign that we are, from a strategic point of view, quite united as an expert community, and I would hope the policy community as well. We have said in our different institutions and fora that we see Russia as the most direct and strategic threat. And this survey actually shows that, and it shows that across the spectrum, from the stakes of a bad deal in Ukraine to the destabilizing impact of hybrid activities, and to the skepticism towards a quick transition towards a different type of relationship. Which, to me, if I had to take out one policy, so what would be, we must be ready for long-term adversarial relations. At least that's what our experts are saying, and I might, unfortunately, tend to agree. As we prepare for an adversarial relationship or what is a aggressive and risk-prone actor, I think it's fair enough that we're looking at all the risks, and that include the nuclear risks. So even though it is marked as low likelihood, I think it makes sense that we reflect deeply on it because of the impacts, which would be, of course, catastrophic. That said, I actually agree 100% with Enrique's analysis. I think that on the one hand, we cannot responsibly take anything off the table. That wouldn't be responsible. On the other hand, we also need to call out the Russian reckless nuclear saber-rattling for what it is, which is attempts to coerce us and to attempt nuclear blackmail, and we should not give in to it, which I don't think is what we're doing, but at the same time, we need to be vigilant, we need to monitor, and we need to take these threats very seriously. So that's the balance. Not give in to coercion, because that would only invite more coercion, and would also further destabilize the global non-proliferation regime, which is already, I would say, on life support, but at the same time, we cannot ignore the possibility, and we have to be ready and monitor and take it very serious. So that's the square in the circle, I think, from a policy perspective.
If only because look at the story since 24 October. Putin has made a number of misjudgments, very huge misjudgments, at least 3. And I wouldn't exclude that he continued doing so, including nuclear weapons. So, as Benedetta said, this is a question of pure responsibility. We have to factor that.
So this exercise is a forecasting exercise, right? So we want to get ahead of potential conflicts and risks, but if we are successful, we will also be shown to be wrong in a year because there was intervention, and so those things didn't happen. And there's nothing that I think people forecasting this kind of crisis situations would like more than to be proven wrong. And so at the start of the year, when we saw that there was a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas, we thought, yeah, okay, it wasn't on us that we managed to contribute, but that happened. Nevertheless, it looked fragile from the beginning. It's a staged ceasefire. The tensions are still very high, and there are already some breaches. So it's quite vulnerable already. And we will speak in the second panel with the results coming from the United States. But we already know that the opinions are quite similar in the United States about the fragility of a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. I'm wondering, from your perspective, now that the formalities of a ceasefire have started, and in practice we've also seen some hopeful results. What is the EU planning to do next to participate in delivering this outcome?
Well, first of all, is the fragility. This is a ceasefire between the government of Israel and Hamas is by definition a tactical thing, because the declared objective of Netanyahu is to destroy Hamas, full stop. So a ceasefire is something instrumental to the end. We can discuss what destroying Hamas means, because Hamas is military, Hamas is political, and Hamas is a social, ideological. You can never kill the third part of the story. So first, it's a tactical thing, very influenced by President Trump. The future of this situation in Gaza will depend heavily on the American position. We have already seen things from President Trump that really should explain more. So listen, we have our small thing, which is that we will reestablish our mission in Rafah for the passing between Egypt and Gaza. This is our contribution to the ceasefire and to alleviate the humanitarian situation, which is the objective now. But we cannot seriously plan in the medium to long run, because it's not entirely clear what the strategy, the tactic yet, but the strategy of Netanyahu is not entirely clear. What are you going to do with these 1.8 million people that he has cornered in South Gaza and clean, to use President Trump's words, the North? So
So it's fair to say that the EU is rather an observer at this point than a.
Oh, the EU is the only
participant.
organization, the EU is the only international organization apart from the UN that is going to participate actively with the Rafah cross point. It's the only one. But it doesn't mean that we pretend that that will bring an end to the conflict, because the conflict is already continuing and it's going to happen in the real thing, which is the West Bank, not Gaza. So we will see. But again, when I saw in the Middle East the ceasefire, the Israel-Iran thing, I think the question we had to put ourselves is whether this strategy, regional, of Israel, of supremacy, is sustainable or not. Up to now, yes, because the Arab have not reacted. The Arab have not reacted because Israel has been attacking the fundamental enemy of the Arab regimes, which is radical political Islam. But if we start playing with the Palestinians, then things could change. So we will see. This is the real risk.
Benedetta, what's the bandwidth at NATO to deal with the potential of a large-scale military confrontation between Israel and Iran?
Right. Well, I think that the risks, again, if I'll get to the bandwidth. The bandwidth is we need to be, from a NATO perspective, the answer is we have one core mission, which is to ensure the collective defense of allies, and that has to be from all threats. So we have a multi-directional deterrence and defense policy. But in terms of how do we prepare for what are, I think, multiple compounded risks in the Middle East and North Africa, I think there's a few interesting notions maybe to draw out just analytically. One is, and we talked about it before, the interrelationship with the interlinkages between the different theaters. And that's something that came across a little bit in the responses, but perhaps it would be worth pondering further. And what I mean is the adversarial alignment between the People's Republic of China, Russia, Iran, and the DPRK, and how their strategic convergence and self-reinforcing cooperation is actually contributing to destabilization in multiple theaters simultaneously. So by that, I'm bringing the Middle East and the Iran-Russia relations closer to Europe and our strategic interest. The other element, just analytically, and we do not have a role, so I'm not going to talk policy, just as an analyst, what I see is that perhaps we have a status quo bias a little bit as analysts in looking at the Middle East, in the sense that I do anticipate, we see fragility, which I think is fair enough. We see multiple crises, which I think is fair enough. But if you look at the last 12 months, there's supposed to be movement in terms of shift of the balance of power. There perhaps been an overconfidence or an overestimation of the strength of Iran and its proxies and partners. Maybe that's also interesting for us. And all of that led to quite significant changes, including in Syria. So again, I'm not just analytically, I think we also need to be ready for the fact that there is change occurring. It may not always be for the better, it might be for the worse, but there also may be opportunity to seize along the way, even in the midst of this instability. So I would just put a note of, yes, things are complicated, but maybe there's changes in the region that could also lead to perhaps some openings not for NATO necessarily, but more for us as Europeans.
To the extent that you can disclose this for an audience, a public, can you tell us whether your observations, Benedetta, of the transition in the United States and how that's affected, just briefly, the planning for NATO?
Right. So I think that I was expecting this question. You will also expect my answer, which is, what is it today, January 28th? So give us a little bit more time to continue our conversations with our counterparts on the other side of the Atlantic. But where we are so far, I think that there is, and it's reflected clearly in the responses here, right? And the reason why I think there is such a high degree of attention from European experts towards the state of the transatlantic relations is a recognition of how important and fundamental that is to our security and defense. So that is not a bad thing. I think that's a reflection of reality, and it's a good thing that it comes up as one of our top concerns. The question is, how do we, where I sit, my question is not so much how do I admire potential problems, but how do I think about continuing to future-proof the relationship and make it solid. And from that perspective, I think we have a fairly clear list of things that, as Europeans, we got to do. And those things we have to do, not because of who sits in the White House, but quite frankly, because who sits in the Kremlin or sits in the broader strategic environment. And that's about increasing our responsibility through more burden sharing. So that's defense spending, strengthening our defense industry. There's a lot of things that we have to do anyways, and those are really essential both to increase our own capacity and strength and to future-proofing the transatlantic relations. So that's a very long-winded way to say that I think I would rather focus on the homework, what we have to do, because it's in our interest and in the interest of the alliance, rather than speculating on potential disagreements.
Well, since our experts are also foreseeing new Russian military action in non-NATO neighboring states, I'm hoping that the calls across the Atlantic will start being more frequent, and that the transition will get into a space of comfort very soon. I also want, we have a very short time before Benedetta needs to go directly to SHAPE and share the results of this survey. And so I want us to focus also a little bit on some of the other risks that we didn't refer to. There's still, it's here, it's according to our methodology, is perceived as remote, but there is still a chance of quite impactful and a significant chance of outbreak of organized political violence, including extremist groups in the EU. We've also seen that one of the high risks comes from cyber attacks, which is practically an imminent risk. It's a continuous activity that our enemies are having over the EU. And I think it's important to notice that an outbreak of political violence also between U.S. Democrats and Republicans, which was a high possibility and it was on everyone's mind before the elections, is still ranked quite high. So even if we focus on all these threats that are coming from external actors, there's also a lot of issues that could lead to violent conflict at home that can still destabilize the EU's interests. Importantly, when we define the EU's interests, we didn't only look at security. We looked at prosperity, we looked at unity and coherence. The unity of the European Union is the fundamental requirement for the EU to survive. So I think I want to end on with just a quick reactions to how do you see the relationship going forward between your organizations and the politics at national level, and whether that's going to also be a source of risk amplification.
In the case of the European Union, is a key part of the story. As you said, unity is not just a precondition to act, is a precondition to exist in the case of the European Union. It's some of the risks identified here in hybrid and political movements, all of them goes in the same direction, undermining that unity. We had, I said before, in Russia, a spectacular unity on the answer. That collapses the moment the conflict in the Middle East started. Our member states have completely different views, not just of what's going on, but why and what should be the future. And this is undermining our internal coherence. So I think that, in my mind, after Vladimir Putin, the main risk we have is the internal cohesion and unity of the European Union for the future. Sooner or later, we will see a couple of that crisis in a couple of member states, we will go back to 2008, to the financial crisis, because the euro is not ready for another debt crisis. So all these things that are not here could be the real risk for next year.
I could agree word for word and just swap the word NATO for the word EU, in the sense that for us as well, of course, the internal cohesion and unity is a center of gravity. So anything that impacts on it impacts on our freedom of action, our ability to mobilize. So the same concerns that I think our colleagues have on the European Union side about internal frictions, about potential political paralysis, about internal disagreements, potential for extremism. I mean, the threat of terrorism, which we haven't mentioned, but I think has never gone away. We probably would be well put to continue to put it at the center of our analysis. All of these internal issues have a very direct impact on our ability to act and to be coherent. So word for word, and there's a lot of non-violent conflict-related risks, as Enrique rightly mentioned, about inequality, about financial stability, that also interact with our with security, defense, and foreign policy. So it's very difficult to neatly compartmentalize between the non-defense and the defense. It's all intermingled.
It's an ideological thing, you know. In the past, I mean, Stephen, we had been, I don't know how many years, when one member state wanted something, we tried to define the interest, the quid pro quo, okay, we give you. Now it's different. Now it's an ideological point. I don't agree with a statement on Belarus elections, not because I had particular interest in, because I don't think that the European Union has to say whether it's democratic or not. This is an ideological point. It didn't exist, how many, 5, 6 years ago? 7? Now it's there. And this is the real problem, that you cannot deal with the typical instruments of assessing interest, what you can give, what you can take. This is the real danger. And NATO, of course, I mean, the ideological camp from the other side of the Atlantic, quite strong too.
Yeah, well, it seems that we live in a world where the loudest voice in the room seems to suck up all the air. So maybe it was also the EU's attempt to have a loud voice on something and try to be unified for an ideological reason that wasn't that contestable in the end. But there's definitely so much more to talk about, and please stay with us for the second panel, where we will also be comparing the results of this survey with what experts think in the United States. And thank you very much for spending the morning with us and for taking the anxiety with you. Please share it widely. It is for the good of the Union. So see you in about 15 minutes, and thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you for the moderation.
Yes, here we are. Thank you so much. Thank you all. I'm here to welcome everyone for the second panel of this event, which is called What to Make of This Using the Survey. So after hearing from the policymakers before, we're going to delve deep into this survey, what it is useful for, how to compare it, and how it can be useful for the opportunities. We were talking in the first panel about opportunities for action to counter these risks. So my name is Giuseppe Spatafora, and I work at the EUISS as the research analyst for transatlantic and EU-NATO relations. It was my honor and pleasure to work together with Veronica and Eric to put together this survey and support them and organize this wonderful event, to which I also want to thank the EUI and EUISS staff for helping us with this. And I'm also honored to chair this conversation. I'm joined on stage by a truly distinguished set of panelists. So starting from my immediate left, I have Paul Stairs, who is joining us from the US. He's the General John Wesley Senior Fellow for Conflict Prevention at the Council of Foreign Relations and Director of the Centre for Preventive Action, which has been carrying out the Preventive Priorities Survey, which is the inspiration behind the EU Global Risk Survey. Then next, there's Vesela Cherneva, who is Deputy Director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And then immediately next to her, Stephanie Hoffman, who's also coming from Florence from the EUI. She's professor at the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies and also the Joint Chair of the Department of Political and Social Sciences. And then we have also journalist voice, Stanley Pignall, who works at The Economist, and you all read Charlemagne. Here we are, here's Charlemagne, you're still with us. So we have a variety of speakers, expertise, think tanks, academia, journalists. This poses to be a fantastic conversation. So again, the title of the panel, what to make of this using the survey. You know, it's very general theme, but it's also very good because we can talk about many things. There are many ways to use this survey. First of all, we can take the temperature of European attitudes. We can compare it. We can compare it across the Atlantic with the American priorities, or we can compare it within Europe. We can compare it across areas of expertise. And we can use it to sort of test our institutional readiness by both governments, member states, and institutions, the EU and NATO, to tackle these risks. And generally, we can update our priors. What have we learned that we didn't know before, or what is surprising, and how can we tackle all these risks? So let me start briefly with showing a couple of data that we did at EUISS, but just digging a little deeper in the survey. And obviously, this is EUI survey, but we did a little more digging and we put together some graphics. One, to start, just a very brief comparison of the EU and US results. Here we're just comparing the tiers, so the level of risk, remote, moderate, and high risk, between the US and the EU survey. And you can see very briefly that we see quite a degree of agreement between the American and the Europeans, especially on the high-risk ones. Obviously, this is a selection of answers and of topics, the ones that are comparable, because not everything is comparable across the two surveys. But you see that both in the US and the EU, the experts are concerned about a favorable ceasefire that is favorable to Russia. They are concerned about cyber or hybrid attacks on the critical infrastructure, either EU critical infrastructure or US critical infrastructure. And they are concerned about the continuation of conflict in the Middle East. There are other points in which there is, like, I don't want to say disagreements, but different ranking of risks. Notably, I guess, because of the role of the United States as a global superpower and the direct involvement in a potential crisis in the Indo-Pacific. In the US survey, there's real risk. They see a high risk of aggressive Chinese action in the South China Sea and of US-China confrontation over Taiwan, which is something that in the European survey is considered moderate risk. Once again, moderate means still high compared in the general scale, but maybe not as high. So again, is this a question of perception? Is this a question of secondary impacts? This is interesting. We'll try to explore it later. There's another interesting comparison here in terms of domestic political violence, which in the US is seen as high. In the EU, well, it should be remote risk. Here it's still moderate, but it's even further away. So in the US, there's a higher concern for political violence at home than the Europeans believe. And then the only two places in which there's a higher risk in the EU survey than in the US is in the area that is closer to our region in the southern neighborhood of Europe, in Libya and the Sahel. And again, this might be just saying where you're sitting matters. So this is just the first point. Another comparison that we made, we tried to separate the responses. We took the average response to the entire survey among all participants. So that's just to get 1 point. And then we disaggregated between respondents coming from Western Europe, Northern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, or non-EU respondents. Couple of things. One, you could say, okay, that in Brussels or in Western Europe, we tend to make a big fuss of everything. There's the ones that drag up both impact and likelihood, as opposed to the other regions of origin. But of course, and there's already something that Veronica hinted at, if you look at the scale, we really zoomed in. This is impact between 3.8 and 3.5. So we're talking about small variations. And this is very interesting because there's a famous story that the Europeans tend not to agree on the strategic threats. There's this famous article on strategic cacophony from 2021 showing that in the Southern Europeans there's a big difference in strategic priorities from the Eastern European. And in fact, if you look at the scale, actually we see quite a lot of agreement in general sense. So that's an interesting point of conversation, which we'll try to explore further. And then the last point that we wanted to show is that since here we have academics, we have members of government and NGOs, we have think tanks, we wonder whether indeed the government and IGO, EU people go together with the think tankers towards a scarier world, also a function probably of them being in Brussels, and the academics instead are more relaxed, at least in terms of impact. Likelihood, no difference. But even then, we're talking about a very small change in the average. So again, we're talking, yes, it's true where you sit is where you think to some extent, but also is this shrinking? Well, obviously this is one data point. We'll see in the future whether this changes. But yeah, some interesting data points to spur the conversation. And now enough from me. We'll return to the original slide, and we hear it from the experts. Let's start with Paul. Paul, you've been running the Preventive Priorities Survey for more than 15 years, so perhaps now you can tell our audience what you think the most striking features of the US survey from this year is, and if you want to make additional comparison to what we've been saying today. So take it away.
Well, thank you, Giuseppe, and thank you all for being here. I want to particularly recognize Stephen and Eric and Veronica for such a terrific job here. They say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and I'm tremendously gratified to see the product or instrument that I set up many, many years ago in the US now being adopted in the EU, and I hope it continues. I've started to have grand thoughts of maybe doing an Indo-Pacific equivalent to this, and so meeting here a year from now with perhaps some Japanese and Korean or Chinese scholars, and we can compare 3 different regions. But what I thought I would do is sort of say a little bit about areas of convergence, divergence, and things that surprised me in the results. As you said, Giuseppe, we've been doing this for over 15 years now. And I look upon it as a sort of barometer of anxiety. And as in the EU case, I think the level of anxiety for 2025 is off the charts, is unprecedented. In previous years, the most what we call high likelihood, high impact contingencies has been 3, and that was last year. Typically, it's usually only 1, sometimes never. This year we have 5. Interestingly, I think 5 of the high likelihood, high impact EU risks track pretty closely with our one, so that there is, as you've in your slide indicated, quite a high degree of overlap. The actual topics themselves, Israel, Hamas, the Russia, Ukraine, that was very interesting that they tracked quite closely. Russia, Georgia, cyber attack, Iran, Israel, they were all in the US ones. And so it's quite significant. The fact that North Korea dropped down the rankings was a little surprising for us in the US. It's always been a tier 1 concern, and it went down, I think, to tier 2. The fact that the possibility of instability in Moscow, regime change, that wasn't even on our list this year. It was on the EU list. The fact that the Balkans is considered relatively low risk, I find interesting for both sides of the Atlantic, given what we know happened in the Balkans in the 1990s, and I'll get back to that in a minute. In terms of divergence, I think some of them are fairly understandable. The EU is obviously more concerned about threats emanating from Moscow. No real surprise there. Whereas the US is clearly more interested in potential Chinese aggression, Taiwan, South China Sea. So that's not too surprising in terms of the divergence. Our survey gives higher concern around Lebanon, whereas I think EU is lesser a concern. You mentioned, Giuseppe, the risk of sort of political violence, terrorism, mass casualty terrorism, which used to dominate the US risk assessment when we started 10 years ago. It doesn't even appear now. It's extraordinary. The whole 9/11 repeat scenario just doesn't come into play, whereas it's still evident now evident in the EU one. Interestingly, last year, the number one concern was the possibility of political violence, domestic terrorism around the US presidential elections. And previously, we had never, ever included a domestic contingency in our survey, but we had to as a result of this demand from the crowdsourcing process that we go through to select our contingencies. This year's still a tier 1 concern, interestingly, and around increasing polarization. Let me just wrap up in terms of the surprises. I am frankly, I still trying to figure out why Israel Hamas is ranked so high from both sides of the Atlantic. If you look at sort of classic geopolitical military threats, to me, I get the likelihood side of it, but I don't quite get why the impact is so high. Is it because it's been so polarizing in our respective polities and societies that is the source of real concern here? I'm surprised that the risk of a NATO-Russia conflict is relatively low. I get why the risk of Russia's use of nuclear weapons is considered low, but I would have thought, given all the other risks around Moscow's more assertive, aggressive action, I would have thought that the risk of, therefore, a NATO-Russia conflict would have been much higher. So that surprised me. The point that Veronica mentioned, I think, is particularly interesting, that the level of confidence in the US commitment to Europe is clearly dropping. What I was not expecting was to see that European respondents had a similar low expectation about the US following through on its security commitments to its Asian allies, Indo-Pacific allies. So you have this sort of contradiction between Taiwan, South China Sea being high probability events, but the likelihood of there being a direct US-China clash is considered low. So that can only mean that the Europeans think that the US is essentially not going to come to the assistance of Taiwan or Philippines. And I find that quite surprising, frankly, quite concerning. Just some omissions or missing contingencies. I think both surveys have their gaps. I was shocked that Sudan doesn't show up anywhere in the EU list. whereas, you know, this is one of the most horrific ongoing conflicts in the world as we speak, yet it didn't even show up in the US, in the EU one. No DRC either, given what's been happening recently. For us in the US, the fact that nowhere in South America is considered of any concern, especially given relative proximity, was also a factor. And I mentioned that the low ranking given to the Balkans. So that's a sort of broad brush, 30,000-foot kind of comparison of the two. I'd be happy to sort of zero in on other findings as people see they're interested in hearing.
Thank you so much, Paul. Indeed, I'm sure that will be a lot of discussion and ideas coming up from this, and you'll be asked to intervene over and over again. But indeed, thanks for this comparison. Of course, the Preventive Priorities Survey is also available on the CFR website, so do go check it out if you haven't done so. Now, you mentioned about indeed various areas of the world where there's comparison, similarities and difference with the Europeans. You also mentioned the Balkans, which is a good segue into Vesela's intervention, because of course she has a lot of expertise in that region of the world and of Europe. And I know that also ECFR has been doing a lot of work in there as well, also in terms of surveys as well and public opinion. So for you, I wanted to start off by asking you about this surprising, perhaps, result that there are little differences between the Western Europeans and the Central and Eastern Europeans, to basically ask whether you think that there's a movement towards some sort of strategic unity within the European Union. But then, of course, this is a way for you to talk about whether you see something that is missing in this survey and that perhaps in public opinion is showing, or in other areas of research, of course. So please, Vesela.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe, and it's great to be here. And indeed, we at ECFR are working on various aspects of both European internal unity and public opinion, but also how global publics look at the EU. And if I may just take a step back, a step of maybe 10 years, 2014, when we started polling, it turned out that there's, if you remember, that there were two lines of divisions in Europe. One was about Russia, right? And there was a clear East-West divide. So Eastern Europe was much more acutely aware of kind of the threat coming from Russia. Western Europe was basically quite complacent. And then there was the second dividing line, and it was a north-south dividing line on spending. It was right after the financial crisis, and the division between net contributors and net recipients in the EU was triggering all sorts of reactions towards different policies. And so those two dividing lines were not only not overlapping, they were actually making any decision much more complicated. What we see today, if I have to come to your point of convergence, is actually that the division on the issue of spending and the division on the issue of the need for defense and the threat perceptions are actually much more overlapping now. That means that a big group of the so-called frugals are actually now much more willing to talk about common European defense, to talk about defense initiatives, to talk about higher defense spending. Having said that, I think Central and Eastern Europe is actually split. And we have seen this, our data on the intra-European survey of this year is coming in less than 2 weeks, coming out, but without giving you the numbers, because I'm not supposed to, I'll just try to describe some of its elements. But it seems that the south of Europe and the southeast of Europe, especially, is much more has moved much more towards kind of a Trumpian, let's put it this way, version of European security, meaning quick peace, quick ceasefire, no matter what the price of the peace, what kind of peace in Ukraine. Trump as the big peacemaker. That is a bunch of countries, that is a group of countries that probably, we haven't polled all 27, but my suspicion is that this group of countries stretches all the way to Poland, basically. We have polled Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia. We have also data from Greece. But I would assume that others in this region are also kind of gravitating around this topic. And then you have the Baltics, the Poles, the Baltics, and the Nordics being much more on the front foot in terms of both European defense and reacting to the Russian aggression. One thing, if I may, on your on the results that really struck me, it was this idea that US isolationism is not very likely. And while those surveys are great for our community because they confirm all our biases, and we're very happy to listen to those results, I think this one we have to really take with caution, because this is a sin we should not commit. We should not stick to the world of yesterday, and we should not reproduce the things that made us comfortable yesterday. And I think talking about the US today, we have to be quite aware that this is a very different reality. Last point on the things that are missing, because this was also one thing that you asked me to do. Missing is clearly the geoeconomic risk. And this is probably going to be the big one for Europe this year. Not also in terms of external coercion. We're talking a lot about tariffs. We're talking about trade wars. But obviously, internally, the risk of turning the momentum on the European kind of economic reforms into a missed opportunity. I think this is a great risk if we continue using the Draghi report for, for bad predictions but no action. And the other big risk I think that is missing is the crisis of multilateralism and the bilateralization of a lot of conflicts or let's say power ambitions. We thought that the history of Europe has taught us not to repeat the Ribbentrop-Molotov type of approaches. But if we happen to be in a world where everybody can basically claim a piece of land which is somebody else's, and this cannot be stopped via a multilateral system and the international law as it has been so far since the end of the Second World War, I think we're in a place, in a new place where we will have to navigate through a huge amount of new types of security risks. I mean, we didn't hear anything from, not only from Brussels, but also from Washington on the Belarusian elections. Does it mean that this is, you know, somebody else's sphere of influence where we're not supposed to say anything about? If something happens in Belgrade tomorrow, is this something that we're gonna, again, remain silent about and do nothing even more? And in the Balkans in general, we have a lot of conflicts of this sort. Central Asia, is this the next one, you know, after what we see in the South Caucasus? You know, Cuba, and so on and so forth. So I understand that all of that may sound science fiction to us, but oh boy, who thought that we would be talking about Greenland so much?
That's right, and indeed, you know, we always have to keep one step ahead and think of these risks plus the other ones. And thank you for mentioning specifically the fact that other areas that are not, we don't immediately associate with conflict-related risks, such as this one, can turn into conflict-related risks, geoeconomic confrontation over resources, or over supply chains, or even the crisis of multilateralism, preventing opportunities to resolve conflict. And this is a good moment to bring Stephanie in the conversation, who has vast expertise in the behavior of international organizations, including the EU and NATO. So I wanted to ask you specifically about the institutions, whether you think that the institutions and the member states of the mostly overlapping membership are ready to navigate the risks that we see in 2025, and whether you see any opportunities for action for these institutions or for the most important actors. So are we ready?
Thank you. Thank you, Giuseppe, also for the question. Thank you for Stephen, Eric, and Veronica for the invitation to speak here today. I'm a little bit sleep deprived, so I'm sorry, but I'm going to hold on a little bit onto my laptop here. But I mean, I think we heard quite a bit already about these super pertinent 30 risks that were already mentioned. And I think even we see that Russia ranks really, really high. It might even rank higher than we think, because even issues like cyber attacks are ranking fairly high. And I assume lots of experts assume when they hear cyber attacks that they even imply Russia mostly as the actor behind such attacks. So when I looked at the survey, I initially thought it's pretty reassuring. I'm not super surprised about some of the results, but as Benedetta already mentioned as well, to me, I'm actually intrigued by the fact that experts don't think much about the Indo-Pacific theater as a threat. And something that was mentioned very briefly is that power struggles within Moscow are ranked really low as risks. To me, that's actually, I mean, I'm not
opportunities, they're not risks.
Well, but I'm not a Russia expert, but from what I hear is if Putin should pass away anytime soon, it's not clear, right, who's going to come to power and how much more assertive and aggressive that new source of power actually would be. So this is something to me where maybe we could talk a little bit more about. So moving to NATO and the EU, I read the survey a little differently, and so I'm curious about the discussion that will follow. Actually, when I looked at the survey, I thought, experts still seem to think that NATO more or less works. Because if we look at it, okay, the US isolationism ranks as a high risk, but the other high-risk scenarios are a ceasefire that favors Russia and a military action against a non-NATO member state. Direct conflict between NATO and Russia, or the use of Russian nuclear weapons, are seen as moderate risks. And here both of them are coded as not very likely, but possibly impactful, right? So when I was looking at this, I'm like, experts seem to think that the defense posture and the deterrence posture of NATO is still working fairly well. But I heard already in the first panel that not everybody saw this way. But to me, I'm like, there's an indication that at least deterrence defense could work in the name of NATO. The picture is less clear to me when we look at the EU. So the items that pertain directly to the EU show that an attack against the EU critical infrastructure is deemed very likely and also very impactful. Irregular migration towards the EU is understood in the same terms. A terrorist attack within the EU is understood as moderate instead. Violent radicalization is seen as remote risk to the EU. And then if we look at the 24 missions and operations that the EU has ongoing at the moment, according to experts, missions and operations in places in and or Ukraine, or for Ukraine, Georgia, or Palestine are happening in these high-risk places, but otherwise they're also in the moderate, or rather in the low end of risks. So where does that leave us, right, for in terms of action? And here I want to first mention a couple of things that Veronica already mentioned, right? Here, the risk is defined as the risk to EU interests, and EU interest is defined as coherence, unity, security, and prosperity. And if I may start off with a few caveats here, to me, these are some very complex political concepts that arguably operate not always the same way for all experts that we're asking, right? So across experts, some might actually think that unity is most important or security is most important, but they don't necessarily have to go together. And the other caveat that I would like to mention here is, while we're comparing the US and the EU at the moment, these are two different political beasts, at least if you ask me, right? I mean, the US is a state, and especially if it comes to foreign security and defense policy, this is mostly, if not completely, conducted in Washington, D.C. When we talk about European foreign security and defense policy, this is not only conducted in Brussels. It's not a sole competence of the European Union. There are national prerogatives that have to be taken into account. And so these national prerogatives, I think, have to also be understood a little bit when we talk about how the EU should face a global risk. So I'm happy to hear that this is a proof of concept, and I'm wondering whether, for example, one could actually include these kind of more national prerogatives also in the global risk assessment. So what experts think about national defense budgets actually, and where they're going, or EU funding schemes and instruments, or all the decision-making structures, are they actually also part of a risk to European, say, unity, for example, right? We have not qualified majority voting in these policy domains, so it would be nice to hear a little bit more about that. So now moving back to what can be done, or what the EU can do, I actually think that the EU and its member states already face and prioritize Russia and the US quite a bit. I mean, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen did not have to mention the Trump administration in Davos for her speech to be very much about that administration and its threat and its mentioning of tariffs. And we can see that policies and budgets are assigned to help bolster Ukraine and attempts to procure and produce more European in the defense sector. Some might even say that the EU acts to the best of its abilities, since not everyone in the EU, and we'd heard about this already, agrees on how to engage with these risks and actors. And I think we need to be a little bit more humbler here when it comes to EU foreign security policy. The EU is not a state, and talking as if it is one is not always helpful, and it can create unrealistic expectations. And these expectations sometimes can backfire. So what can be done more? To me, investing in European defense procurement and European defense production is one case in point, for example. I mean, these are still fragmented. That's also what's, for example, been highlighted in the Draghi report. The EU has put forward off-budget and other instruments to improve the financing of its European defense cooperation and its industry. But of course, this can be pushed more. And what I find, I don't want to say reassuring, but a good sign is that many European governments have already signaled that 2% of the GDP is not enough in the defense spending, that some are really willing and talking about 3%, though Trump is now asking for 5%. So of course there is still disagreement about that, but at least what we can see is that national defense budgets are going up. And this, I just want to mention, is actually often still going against, or not against, but have to be seen also with a skeptic European public in mind. I mean, granted, when we look at the European Council on Foreign Relations surveys or the Eurobarometer, what we can see is that overall the European public is more and more in favor of military expenditures, right? But I think these kind of trends have to be seen a little bit more cautionary. With a few colleagues, we did a survey experiment, and no methodology is perfect, so I'm not going to claim that we have it. But in this particular survey experiment we asked 40,000 respondents across 25 European states. I say 25 because the UK was part of the sample as well. And try to see, like, first of all, whether they support an increase in military spending, and also whether they support more military operations in the name of the European Union. And there was an agreement. But then when you actually, with vignettes, try to see how they would react if they're confronted with the actual cost that implies, the different trade-offs that means, the public becomes more skeptic. Right? I mean, there's not an infinite pool to pay for European security, and the moment that you realize that actually there's other things that can be paid out of this pool, there's more skepticism here. So European governments are signaling more willingness to spend, and that is great. The public might not follow, equally likely to be seen. One more thing I think that needs to have more attention, or deserves our attention, is how EU member states, what they think what should become out of NATO. So the Trump administration sings this loud song of Buy American, right? And one function of NATO always has been for European NATO members to buy American military hardware. But if NATO only becomes this, EU member states have to seriously consider what the alliance is actually for. So for me, it was super surprising. I was in a workshop in South Africa in October, and when I talked to South African scholars and asked them what they think about the upcoming US elections, they all said, we hope that Trump will win. And I was like, why is that? And they said, so that you Europeans finally get your act together, right? Like, you've always just followed what the US is saying. Please speak up with a stronger voice. And I think the most recent European Council on Foreign Relations survey shows the same, right? It actually shows that many across the world think that the Europeans are more or less on par with China and the US and should be doing more. It's the Europeans who are skeptical of their own capacities of what they can do. And I think really, like, thinking also what Europeans want NATO to be, not only what Trump wants NATO to be, is something that should actually be discussed much more frankly. And so what can be done about NATO and about European partners? I mean, so one thing, and I'm curious to hear what others think, are these joint declarations that already have been signed between the EU and NATO. I mean, granted, we can say they're mainly symbolic, but these joint declarations actually already target and discuss many of these global risks that we now heard about, right? I mean, Russia actually, military mobility features quite prominently in these joint declarations. So is that a way to actually push for more entanglements between both organizations and pursuing that more? And if there's a problem to do this formally between both organizations, can this be used as a springboard for, like, those who are willing to actually use the infrastructure of both organizations to pursue more ambitious security and defense projects? And then when it comes to partners, again, what the Council of the ECFR, if I may use the acronym, has shown actually others want to see, I wonder whether actually we could consider something that Patrick Pavlak and I recently called the EU's narrative power. So that is building coalitions in different forums by combining different interests, not shared interests per se, but different interests and preferences in one policy frame and narrative. In this Carnegie piece, we argue that contrary to what the current global context suggests, power and influence in international politics are measured not only in terms of missiles and money, but also in the way that you can actually build alliances and combine these different interests in a convincing policy frame. That means not pursuing a policy that is you're either with the European Union or you're against the European Union, but the European Union has these preferences. What are your preferences? Can we combine them? And we can see this, for example, in the cyber domain, where different EU preferences are combined with different capacity building preferences of other countries that we see located in the global south. So I think there's actually, we can think about value contestation through deliberation in these kind of terms.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. There's really a lot in there, and I'll give the opportunity to the other panelists to also mention opportunities that they see emerging from the analysis of these risks. Thank you also for talking about, the the different actors and components of European defense, which is obviously something that is in mind of many people in this room as we approach the white paper on European defense that is going to be published in a little more than a month and a half. So, and there's a lot of discussion there of what are the components and what is the best EU angle to really show that the EU has an added value to defense, in addition to, indeed, the national competences that you were saying. Now, let's go to Stanley. And, of course, you write the Charlemagne column, and I'm sure that, and I expect that the next one will be about the survey to EUISS. So I wanted to ask if you wanted exactly to focus on, if you wanted to write about the survey, what would you focus on? What do you think are the takeaways that are most interesting to people that are even beyond this room? So how do you approach that, connecting the experts to the public as well?
Like Stephanie, I'm also sleep deprived, but it's mainly because I got sent the survey a couple of days ago, and after reading it, I found getting any kind of sleep to be particularly difficult. The sum of anxieties contained in the responses of 400 people is truly awe-inducing. For me, a real value of the survey is it unfocuses the mind. We spend so much time focusing on stuff. We focus on the day's headlines as journalists, as think tankers, as policymakers, and you kind of jump up on whatever's happening at that particular moment. And if you can kind of take a step back and you can see what everybody else is worrying about in their own fields, as I've discovered, you then take on their anxieties and you bring them on as your own. I hope the effect wears away after a while. But it's the hierarchy of concerns that I think is a useful thing. And sometimes, I don't know what people here felt when they read it, but there's sometimes you see something and you think, oh, you know what, I hadn't necessarily thought of this as an issue that I should worry about, and now it's kind of on my radar screen, and you hope it never happens, but when it does happen, your mental model is a bit ready for it. And then actually sometimes you see something which is on your radar screen, and you don't think other people were worrying about it, and you're like, okay, great. Actually, people are worried about this cyber stuff. I don't think we're paying half as much attention as we should on this cyber stuff. And I was really glad to see it as a big red bubble near the corner of doom, as I call it, the kind of high likelihood, high impact. So yeah, comparing notes with 400 anxious people is particularly useful for journalists. One thing that reassured me is there is convergence between the US and the European surveys. You obviously have some geographic disparities. We worry more about the Sahel and Libya and so on, but that's only the way it should be. But at least our vision of the world, at least until a week ago, was we saw the world in comparable ways. I think if we do that survey in other bits of the world, in Asia Pacific, it may look really, utterly, completely different. But there, the community of concern, what unites us is our fears more than anything, feels like it's still there. Now, we now have a whole new bunch of concerns because every time we open the newspaper, I guess we open apps these days, every time you open your app, you see something vaguely crazy coming out of Washington. And so that is a new source of sleep deprivation for the both of us. As a journalist, I feel like I have a mandate to kind of speculate how others will look at this. Next week, there's a meeting of EU leaders in which they're going to talk about defense. It's not another one of these EU summits, which we have. My God, it felt like we were having them every 3 weeks at one point. This is no notes, no conclusions, no action points. It's a kind of first discussion. What do we want the world to look like from a defense point of view? And I think all the leaders who will have read this, or maybe their aides will have read this, will recognize some of the kind of the concerns in the corner of doom. I think the bad peace in Ukraine is kind of one of them, and is right now in the forefront of people's minds. And the U.S. isolationism, I think now is probably off the charts compared to where it was when the survey was done. And the one that we don't talk about enough, I think, as well, is migration, which is migration looks different to all the different corners of the EU in the same way that the Russia threat looks very different if you're in Portugal than if you're in the Baltics. But migration is the one issue that 27 national leaders sitting around a table in the European Council know can cost them their job. Whether you're in Ireland, whether you're in Poland, whether you're in Greece, whether you're in France, whether you're in Germany, the issues are going to be different. The impacts of migration is going to be different. It could be legal migration. It could be illegal migration. It could be around housing. It could be around integration, whatever it is. It is the one issue that they know can cost them their job. And if you see what's happening in the German campaign at the moment, that is clearly not a point that has been lost on those politicians. There's three risks that kind of don't appear that high up, and maybe they're just difficult to identify, but I'll kind of add them to the list of anxieties, because as if we don't have enough of them. The biggest one that I think has kind of really dominated the discourse, at least in Brussels, aside from the Russia bit, is this risk of drift into irrelevance. Geopolitical irrelevance, economic irrelevance, commercial irrelevance, technological irrelevance, demographic irrelevance. You alluded to the Draghi report. It puts its fingers on all these things. There's now, again, a new anxiety that we know what the problems are, we just don't know how to handle them. I feel like I'm adding new anxieties as we go on. But that is one which is a kind of this real sense of pessimism that has enveloped Europe, and a sense of not knowing how to get out of it. And obviously the new administration in the US makes it much more difficult. The second one, which does kind of appear in the survey, but not quite in this way, is the idea that Europe is going to be caught in a sort of China-US sandwich, and we are going to get what we're given. And taking what we're given might mean Chinese commercial surpluses that no longer can make it to the US, and they come here, and then we're left as the world's only free traders, and that then causes havoc. The risk of some kind of alliance of minds between China and Trump, even when it comes to Ukraine. These are kind of issues that I think will creep up the anxiety list. And the third one, and I can't read my own handwriting, but it was important. Fragmentation, yes. Yes, and this is absolutely not a new risk. It's the oldest risk in Europe, but it's, can we pull ourselves together? There are crises in Europe. I mean, I hate that Monet quote about, Europe being driven by crises and the sum of solutions to the crises. I think it's wrong on pretty much every count. But there are good crises in Europe, and there are bad crises. In Europe. There are some crises that do unite us and that force us to push in the same direction. And there are crises that divide us. And I'm not sure where we are now, but my sense is we will get this next week. We will get a flavor of this on Monday as the EU leaders meet, that you still have divisions within Europe, how they view Russia, and I think that point around the kind of southeastern, south of Poland, eastern fringe is really important. There are still some people in Europe who just don't care about the situation in Ukraine, right? Look at the NATO defense spending stuff, right? We're going to talk about 3.5%. We're going to talk about 5%. There are going to be some EU leaders next week, and then again in NATO, at the NATO summit in June, who are going to be staring very hard at their shoes for an hour, while the rest of the room explains to them that Europe is at war and that we need to do more, and they're going to be thinking, you know what, I'm in the middle of a budget crunch at home, and I was kind of hoping to cut defense spending, and now I'm going to have to go from 1.5% to 3.5%. It's not going to happen. Those divisions are going to fester. The last thing I'll leave you with is just it's the unknowable one, which is like what's happening with the US and with the transatlantic relationship. And the way that we're thinking about it at The Economist, and this is a discussion amongst colleagues, is the margin of what's possible, the range of potential outcomes is just so much bigger. It's bigger than Biden, and it's bigger than Trump won. Who's going to be the next Denmark? Who's going to be the next Colombia? What's it going to be about? And we just don't know. And so the sense that this is the kind of the cornerstone of our security alliance is kind of the overarching anxiety that will cause me to lose even more sleep.
Indeed, and probably this is something we all share, because of course we've seen, and all the experts agree with, it's so impactful as a nuclear bomb, so it's so essential. I know I want to give to the audience the opportunity to ask questions, but before that, I know I also wanted to highlight and ask those of you who haven't been able to do so to talk more about the opportunities that emerge from this, and I know that Vesela is ready to come in. And
I just very briefly, I totally agree that fragmentation is a big risk. However, fragmentation may be also an opportunity, because there are good crises and bad crises, but there's also maybe bad fragmentation and good fragmentation. And so if we think about it from the perspective of creating groups, coalitions of willing who can work, especially on European defense, pushing kind of the frontier further than at 27, it's fine by me. So in a way, just sinking in our anxieties, I think is a bit of a danger, and not trying to. I think we have to try and get also the opportunities angle, and from that perspective, two more opportunities I would maybe highlight. We don't know our power to disrupt. We haven't found it. And this is one thing that a lot of our partners and also rivals use. I'm not saying we should go to Kaliningrad, to Königsberg immediately, but we have to be able to think a bit out of the box.
You should give it to Trump.
And I think we have to work also on our unpredictability, because this is another thing that this world has become very much about. We don't know who the next Greenland or Canada or whatever will be, or Colombia. But we have to also be able to do unpredictable moves if we're to stay in this game.
Yeah, this is the point that Macron was making. We were discussing this last night. But Macron wanted to introduce this idea that, Putin should be on his toes a little bit. Putin, we shouldn't necessarily telegraph everything that we're going to do and show him exactly where our red lines are, so he can put his feet right on top of the red line. And so that's why he was pushing this idea that, hey, maybe we will send troops in Ukraine. But it works a lot better if you then don't have a press conference from the German chancellor 3 minutes later saying, we will never, ever send troops to Ukraine.
Well, thank you. Paul, does any opportunities to deal with this isolation issue?
Well, I think the results show that, that the US has a lot more to do to reassure its allies of its commitments. Whether this administration is predisposed to do that is a big question, but I think before too long, the US administration will come to appreciate the value of allies and partners, because there are so few things in the world that can be done alone, and that they will need to reassure allies and seek partners on certain projects, whether they're in institutional frameworks or coalitions of the willing, but that requires some form of reassurance that the US is going to have their back. At the same time, the reassurance goes the other way, and I think the results here show that the Europeans need to do more to reassure the US of its commitment to fulfilling shared goals and sort of defending core interests too. In terms of sort of the takeaways to do, everyone's sort of looking at this incredible list of risks, and and knowing that our bandwidth to manage simultaneous crises is so limited, and it's not hard to imagine we could be facing multiple simultaneous crises, and the collective shock and stress on our system with that kind of sort of, some people call it the polycrisis scenario, that could really be very dangerous, and we just got to put a lot more effort into widening our bandwidth. But clearly, I think the more hopeful takeaway is that the overlap of our concerns is quite significant, and that should be the basis or foundation for a cooperation. But we just got to make sure that that cooperation is seen as equitable, that we do, each do our bit to produce the kind of outcomes we want. And if that's lacking, then we are really going to be in a very dangerous place.
Burden sharing goes both ways.
Exactly.
All right, then we have about 15 minutes left, so I'm happy to open the floor for questions. Please just raise your hands and just please tell us who you are, what your position is, and then ask the question, and let us know if you're referring to one specific panelist. So first one over there, and then we have two questions over here.
Hi. Back here, Oliver Kim with the Austrian newspaper Die Presse. I'd be interested in each panelist's expectations for what the EU should achieve in defense terms until summer, until the NATO summit. So what should actually specifically come out of all these retreats and European councils and so forth? Thank you.
Thank you. So defense opportunities for the EU and needs. So there were two questions here up front.
Thank you. I work for the European Commission. I work for the General Secretariat of the Commission in the directorate that deals with defense, economic security, and preparedness. So I'm also the president of the board of the Institute. So thank you very much for this. I find this very timely because, as you may know, in a couple of months we'll present the preparedness strategy. And foresight is important there, so please go on with this work. But my question, however, is on the scope. Because I understand that this was a study that focused on EU perceptions for EU on conflict-related threats, 425. Recently, we had another study, similar study from the World Economic Forum that actually did something similar, but actually they looked at a much broader area. So if you count the 6 threats for this year, conflict-related is the number 1, but none of the other 5. And if you look at what they see as risk for 10 years, there's none relevant to conflict. They took the first 4 are related to environment, and like see the fires, see the earth changes, and 2 are related to technologies, like you talked about cyber, but then the AI-related threats, etc. So my question is, why do you have this scope? Is it methodological? Is it because of resources? Is it because that's where you think is the interest? It also relates to the intended target group of this work. Is it only for State Department and EAS or more? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sure that this question is probably best addressed to those who conducted this study who are currently not in this panel, but we can probably talk about why it is like that, also for comparison with the US, and how it can still be useful and how it connects to the other threats. Please.
Yeah, thank you. Michael Köhler, former senior official in the European Commission, now professor and think tanker. Actually, you stole my question.
Yeah.
And actually, I also thought that this is a question to Eric, to Veronica, and to of course, Stephen, in addition to Giuseppe. I think, Paul, Vessela, and before that, Benedetta, you pointed to some surprising results, or surprise that you had when studying the results of this. And the question is, what is the interpretation for the reason of this? Why are certain sources of conflict or risk underestimated, or where are they missing? Is this because analysts asked in this survey are too parochial? Or is it that really in Europe we have a different threat perception from the United States? Is it that we refuse a global role that some of you have been asking for? When you said, for example, Stephanie, that many see Europe on par with the United States and China, is that not our self-view, for example? Or is it, for example, that simply the kind of sociological basis for this study was too narrow, and one should have gone beyond the scope of traditional security analysts, for example, people who deal more with Africa, Asia, and other countries and so forth? I really wonder, and do you have any recommendations for the next edition of this study?
Excellent, thank you. Let's see, we could take maybe one more. Okay.
Thank you, Dominic, with the legal service of the EAS. I wonder if in this analysis of the threats, maybe I'm descending too much into the micro, as a risk, how the EU is prepared to deal with this new US administration. What I pose this question, because I see a bit of a parallelism with Brexit, no? In the case of Brexit, I think the EU member states were very good in general at coming together, because as we know, the British in fact tried to divide the EU in the negotiation. Now, when we see Trump in the White House, you see like a wide array of approaches so far in how to deal with Trump. No? Those are very happy he won, like Meloni, like Orban. Meloni, of course, is an admirer. She rushed to be present in the inauguration. Then some EU leaders were conspicuously silent, even when the comments on Greenland and the Panama Canal happened. So are we going to see like everyone trying to cut separate deals with Trump, going each way in trying to approach this thing? Or do you think the EU will, member states will come together with a common approach? Thanks.
Thank you so much. Then with the time remaining, let's just tackle these questions. And of course, we have one about the defense homework that the EU has to do in the short term, the next 6 months. We have questions about the scope of the survey. And of course, none of you participated in drafting the survey. So let's put it differently. How can we connect these results to other risks that exist? Some of you already talked about it. And also, how do you connect with specific threats that seem remote, but in fact, they are still there? It's simply that the crises that are very close to home are so great that they basically funnel our attention away. And of course, there's the last question, how to deal with the US, whether the EU and its member states will do it bilaterally versus and whether there is scope for unity. Let's do it maybe in the opposite order as the question. So we start with Stanley.
Oh, thanks. I'll pick up on two of the questions, if I may, not the survey ones, because I don't really feel equipped to say anything interesting about it. On the defense homework, I mean, I'm curious to hear what you're hearing. I think we're looking forward to this meeting next week. My suspicion is Europe will want to throw a big number out, right? It will want to show Trump, you know, we're serious about this. There was talk in December of a 500 billion euro SPV that we could show to Trump that we're very serious about. There'll be big figures: 3.5%, 4%, 5%. Somebody will say 7%. But I expect that that will be the tone until we get to The Hague in I think it's in June for NATO. How credible it is, how credible those figures will be, who knows? The Brexit parallel with the US is a really interesting parallel, but I think it's imperfect. I mean, I'm not surprised in the institutions it would be the parallel that people would want to use, because I think it shows the EU at its finest hour. We're really kind of, campaigned together, and I think, Michel Barnier did a remarkable job keeping everybody on the same page. I mean, he burned through kind of more kerosene than a Formula One team, traveling to all the countries, but it was worth it, right? It was, everybody's on the same page. Where I think the parallel breaks down is that the Brexit didn't matter to a lot of countries, right? The trading relationship between, say, Poland and the UK, or Spain and the UK, or Romania and the UK, it's important, but it's not necessarily a top 10 issue if you're really thinking about it, right? Whereas the security relationship between Poland and the US, that is a super central, primordial, central to the identity of the country. It is what the president and the prime minister think about day in, day out, and they will not subsume it to even somebody as brilliant as Michel Barnier. So I think it's because the stakes are so, I'm not suggesting you should come back, but if I run out of ideas for columns, it might just appear. But so I think it's basically that, is that the issue is too important for people, for national leaders to be willing to kind of give it up to a common position with others that disagree. I wish it were different, but I think that's my take.
Wonderful. Stephanie, please.
Also picking on these two questions first, I mean, to me, I think the Trump administration is the most unpredictable administration that we have in front of us, but there's nonetheless a trend to me. It's not like there were other US administrations before that had a complete different policy towards Europe. I mean, the pivot towards Asia is an Obama policy. It's not even a Republican agenda at the time, right? That already suggested that the US wants to shift its strategic theater towards the Indo-Pacific, away from Europe, withdrawing troops, and also, in that sense, also the security and defense posture, in material terms, would be reduced, right? Or if we think about the WTO, I mean, Trump's policy were not reversed by the Biden administration. In that sense, I mean, there is, in general, I think, a trend where we see that the transatlantic alliance, the transatlantic relationship, has to be rethought, and it should not only, that's why I said it shouldn't be only done by Americans, it should only be also done by Europeans. And I think this is also where I think that could be more on the agenda, the homework for the EU and Europeans to think this through more. It's like, okay, what does that mean in terms of our defense posture, deterrence, projection, right? I mean, we were first about small operations under the umbrella of the Common Security Defense Policy. That was like, how can we project some of our power abroad? At the time, we still needed Ukrainian aircraft carriers to actually fly equipment to places in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I mean, the question is, how do we defend, right? How do we increase our defense posture? And I think this is very much something that needs to be done. And I think there's no surprise that Rutte, for example, became Secretary General of NATO. I mean, there are certain people who have been put in place that actually can link and have more contacts across the Atlantic to do so. In terms of the survey, I'm also maybe not the right person to say, but I mean, my suggestion would be to also tackle into like what experts actually think about the unity of the EU and what that does. So I would look a little bit, not even inwards, because the EU is the EU and its member states, right, as the language often goes when it comes to foreign security defense policy. In that sense, and as it already has been talked about as well, it's like these more geoeconomic, geopolitical risks that are being tied together. So, I mean, when Trump screams tariffs, that also means like, if you don't do as I want in AI, for example, maybe I will impose tariffs. Like, there's so many interlinkages these days across policy domains that this could be maybe picked up a little bit more.
Thank you so much.
Very briefly on the defense question, because I think it's the central one probably for the next 6 months. We need a plan. What happens if Trump withdraws 20,000 US troops in the coming months? We need a plan what to do for the Ukrainian security guarantees, if it comes to that. And we need a longer-term plan on what we do, not only in terms of how much we spend, but also what we spend it on. And this is clearly something that needs to be done together with NATO. And I think in the next 6 months, we have to at least be able to exchange information with NATO, which we currently have difficulties doing. On Trump, I think we have to really stay away from knee-jerk reactions. And in that sense, I am much rather for silence than for constantly issuing statements on his various ideas. So unless we have a real plan, and I think, I believe it was The Economist that pitched this idea of thinking about enlarging to Canada. But if this is, if this is about enlarging our alliances, this is totally, I think, the way to go. Our surveys show that it's Canada, it's South Korea, it's Japan who really see eye to eye with us, but also we see very many similarities with Brazil. We see similarities on some issues, even with India, Turkey, a huge opportunity that we need to explore. So working on those alliances, I think, is going to be much better Trump-proofing policy than many of the other ideas. And coming back to Stanley's point on the self-inflicted irrelevance, this is not what the world expects us to do. The world actually expects the EU to be, and this is what our latest poll indeed is saying, the EU to be really a global actor that can stand eye to eye to the US and to China. And I really hope that we come out of our mode of self-inflicted harm and stand there with more self-confidence.
Last but not least.
So I should probably pass on the question about what the EU should do to respond to Trump, although I have some thoughts, but I'll pass on that. On the defense question, I share both Stanley and Vassela's sort of broad suggestions that the Europeans have to make a very credible statement about their intentions to truly close the burden-sharing gap and to demonstrate that they're really in it for the long haul in terms of building up a respected defense industrial base for the long haul, to actually do some of the necessary investments in key areas that have been sort of dominated by US, and the US is somewhat to blame for this. I'm not saying this is just purely because of European passivity, but there are known areas where the Europeans lack real capabilities. But I think the most important in the short term is a real demonstration of commitment to the future security of Ukraine. There's a lot of concern. I certainly picked this up in London, where I was yesterday, that if there is a short-term or peace agreement, ceasefire, everyone's going to go, oh, the war is over. The conflict is over. We don't have to be so serious now about increasing defense expenditures and budgets. We don't have to worry so much about Russia anymore. And there's going to be this reflexive relaxation of pressure, if you will, to really up the game in terms of defense preparedness in Europe. And so I think there has to be a real credible plan presented for what the Europeans will do to contribute, if there is a ceasefire, to ensuring it stays a ceasefire, and better still, transitions to a political settlement that's durable. That has to be augmented with a real commitment on, I don't know whether they're security commitments or security assurances, particularly about providing financial and other military support to Ukraine over the long haul. But that has to be credible. It can't be, yes, we are behind Ukraine and all the rhetorical things that we often hide behind it. There has to be real, tangible commitment in terms of what Europe will do to preserve the peace or preserve the security and sovereignty of Ukraine. And only that will, frankly, I think, impress Trump. Anything less, and that will just confirm his already strong views about freeloading Europeans and they deserve what they get, sort of thing. So that would be my main concern. On the survey, just very briefly, we've been wrestling with many of the same questions. What to include? Do you go broader? Do you cover economic issues, climate issues, pandemics, and we wrestle with this all the time, and we've often thought, do we do a parallel survey that sort of complements the more focused, narrowly focused survey on specific contingencies? And we're always resistant just because we just don't want to burden, increase the inhibitions that people have to answer the very narrow questions. In terms of broadening the base of responses, I think that is something we can work on, and maybe having a parallel survey that appeals or reaches out to the broader public. I think that would be interesting to see the differences with the expert policy elites types. That would be interesting if someone can support that. I really like the suggestion that people have made that we should have a complementary opportunities, not just risks. And I think that's something that as we go forward, we should probably think seriously about including in this exercise, is the opportunity side. Anyway, that's it.
As it is, and there will be more opportunity to discuss this, and there will be hopefully there will be other versions of the survey in the future that will get better and better, where we're at an excellent start. We're already over time, so I want to hand the floor for the final remarks to our to the directors, Stephen and Eric, but not before thanking this wonderful set of panelists for the truly inspiring remarks and for contributing to the conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, look, you guys have been here for a long morning, and now it's already into the afternoon. I want to thank you for this gift of time and attention. I can't tell you how important this is to us and to our work. I think in terms of closing remarks, obviously there's a lot that the panelists have just given for us to reflect on. There are a few points that I would make. One is that I think we've already seen the value in an exercise like this in terms of generating a remarkable, broad-ranging conversation, a conversation that includes not just policymakers in our first panel, but academics, think tankers, and journalists in our second. I think this conversation is one that helps us better to think about the world around us. And crucially, and this is the second point, it's a conversation that's encouraging us to ask better questions. And so even if this survey doesn't provide all the answers that we may desire, at least we begin thinking in an interrogative way about what kind of questions we should be addressing, where we should be getting better sources of information, how we could use that information in order to come up with answers that are going to help us, and this is the third point, in planning. Because all of this is really about looking to the future so that we can prepare and make ourselves more resilient and better able in the present to manage those future contingencies. And these are essential concerns that we have to face. So to the extent to which this instrument actually pushes us in that direction, I think as a proof of concept, we're in a position now where we're very satisfied with the unbelievable partnerships that we've had, with the support that we've received, with the amazing team that we've built, and with you as a community. And we think that we can take this. I think that we can take this forward. I think in taking it forward, we do need to improve on a number of different domains. I think we need to improve in the way we think about what Europe is and what Europe can hope to accomplish. I don't want to abandon the idea of making comparisons across the Atlantic, but they are not the same things. I think Stephanie is very right on that. I think we need to improve in terms of engaging with different communities. I'm not sure how we do that. I would love suggestions for how we could reach out and expand the reach of our solicitation for input into this survey, because these different communities will give us different insight, we hope, even if that different insight is that the foreign policy consensus extends much more broadly than we might have imagined. I think we can improve in reflecting on the member state level, and this is another point that Stephanie made. I think that's important. One thing that you may not know, and I would encourage you to take advantage of, is the unbelievable strength of the Trans-European Policy Studies Association and its network into individual member states. And we're going to try to leverage that looking ahead in order to get access to the foreign policy community at the national level. How we do that, whether we use the same instrument, I think remains to be seen, but certainly it's an asset that already exists that we can take advantage of, and we should. And as we do so, and this is my last area for improvement, I think we do need to imagine flanking activities. This survey is not meant to be the Swiss Army knife that you take with you when you get stranded on a desert island, the only tool you have to survive in the world around you. It is instead just a start, a provocation that encourages us to think about other modes of research, other instruments we could deploy, and other audiences we could reach. I think Paul's point about how we think about that is important. We don't want to create other instruments that cannibalize the usefulness of this provocation, but we're clear that we do need other instruments, and other instruments means other opportunities for collaboration between our great institutions that we would warmly embrace. And as I say this, I don't want you to misunderstand the importance of the operation that we're involved in. I mean, just think about it. This is central in the preface that is written into Sauli Niinisto's report on enhancing resilience of the European polity, this idea of foresight, the kind of reflection that we're engaged in. And it's a low-hanging fruit in a way that is central to Mario Draghi's conception of competitiveness, because Draghi asks us to take the labor and the capital that we already have and find more intelligent ways to put it together to increase its total factor productivity, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. This was a very low-cost exercise as such things go. And at the same time, I think it's yielded already considerable benefit. And in doing so, and this is the last point, we do this not because we're interested in security as its own curio out in the idea space, but because security is intrinsically connected to everything we do in a way that Enrico Letta argued in making the case that the single market is more than a market. This is something that extends down into the economic domain. And the reason that I emphasize this linkage with the major debates that are taking place today is to stress that making progress in those debates is not something other people do. It's not something that can only happen with tremendous effort. It's something that we can all participate in making Europe stronger as a political entity, in meeting these larger agenda objectives, in working with our colleagues in other institutions to strengthen the way we do our own business. And I think this is a very good illustration of that, because you are here, the press is paying attention, and the ideas that we're talking about are obviously important, not just to us, but to the 400 people who completed our survey. So thank you very much for all of that, and please join me in giving a round of applause, because Stephen made me go first, for the amazing EUISS team that hosted us today. Stephen?
Thank you very much, Eric. You said it all. I thought it was really a terrific asset. I got a call several months ago from a very enthusiastic Professor Jones and say, listen, we have this great idea, this great project that CFR has been running for a number of years, and it triggered a lot of useful conversations in the US. And why don't we do something like that in Europe? And out of that conversation came a wider group and the various partner organizations that you mentioned, Eric, that are behind today's survey. And indeed, I mean, we hope that it will be sort of proof of concept, and I think we can safely say, yes, we achieved that. it's you know, we learned a lot about the sort of the anxiety barometer that Europeans have. We learned a lot about the corner of doom and a lot of sort of catchy phrases that ran through our conversation this morning, and the community of concern and the psychology of irrelevance that we have to combat. I think it demonstrated what I thought, what my sort of hope was for this survey, that it would trigger these kinds of conversations, not just how we see the world and the threats that we face, but also what we're going to do about these threats. I heard a lot of interesting ideas as well about how to improve future editions, and for sure we have to make sure that there will be next year, if not before, an edition. Again, I liked also the idea of perhaps doing it in the Gulf with partners there, or in the Indo-Pacific, and to try to broaden out the number of surveys and to compare and contrast what that brings. If and when we do so in Europe, from my sense, indeed, the whole economic security issue will probably need to be included in some form. The internal domestic risks, the fragmentation, the political trends that we are grappling with that clearly are risks as well in security terms, and then very much the opportunity side. Various colleagues made that point, so let's take these among other ideas as we reflect on where we go next with the survey. My last point, of course, for the Institute, as for many of you in this room, it is, well, so what? What do you want to do about it? And it's quite striking that all the top risks identified by the 400 plus experts sort of perfectly match the kinds of issues that we at the Institute are working on. So how to continue to support Ukraine and prevent this high risk of a bad deal in Ukraine. The broader question of Russia's aggression and all the cyber, hybrids, foreign interference attacks that we come, and indeed, as Vessela rightly said, the sort of timidity that reigns in this domain in Europe, and how we deal with those ever-escalating threats from the Russian side, and perhaps a degree of disruption or a wider set of policy responses that are needed. There we look at that. We look at the Indo-Pacific and how that is in and of itself an area of strategic concern for Europeans, but also how the Indo-Pacific and European security theaters are connected in multiple ways, MENA, Sub-Saharan Africa. So at the Institute, we try to cover the full spectrum, and there we have ideas on all of these, on how we can improve EU policy choices and policy making. So a little plea, there's some further material for you to take home. Let me close now, and thank you for coming, and let's stay in touch. Thank you very much.